Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second installment of the Vermont Forest Health webinar series this year. We have one speaker today. We have Dr. Ali Kosiba, who's the climate forester for the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation, who's going to be speaking to us about the impacts of climate change on Vermont forest health. So I'm definitely looking forward to hearing this talk today. Just a couple housekeeping things. As you may be aware, this webinar is eligible for one SAF or CFE credit for Vermont licensed foresters as well. There is not a pesticide credit associated with this talk today. There will be one next Tuesday. And I think the final real housekeeping thing is for questions for today's talk, if you can enter those in the questions bar on the right side of your panel there, we can answer those at the very end of the talk. You can probably hear my dog dreaming in the background there. But without further ado, I think I'll introduce Ali here and let her kind of take away the show. So Ali, if you're around, then I'll pass it to you.
Great, thanks, Josh, and good morning, everyone. I know there are people here. I can't see you, which is always odd about this webinar platform, but welcome virtually. Yes, so I'm going to talk about impacts of climate change on Vermont forest health, or subtitle, what we know about how trees respond to climate change, and that recognizes that there's a lot we do not know about how trees respond to climate change, and we're learning more all the time. So when we think about climate change, we often think about really acute events, things we can visualize, right? So flood events, heavy rainfall, maybe less snow or shorter snow season like we experienced here in Vermont this winter. Heat waves, extreme heat, ice storms, or other extreme weather events. Of course, pests and pathogens increasing, as Josh and Nicole talked about pests and pathogens last week, and drought. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about just climate change in general, and how the gradual change in our climate can in itself be stressful to trees. And it might be subtle and not visible, but there is this low-grade stress that accompanies climate change. So this, this is an old diagram, and I love this. I think I might be the only person that continues with this. I share it at every UVM class I present at, because I just think it's a great concept. It's Manion's tree decline concept. It's fairly old now, many decades old. But the concept here is that most trees don't die of one single cause. There are exceptions to that, right? Like a chainsaw or fire, other things that can kill, acute events that can kill a tree. But most of the time, it's multiple stress events that decline the tree's health and vigor and can lead to mortality. And often we might attribute the death to the really obvious cause, but there might be other stressors that are confounding to lead to that tree to decline. So the first of these, this outer ring, is just predisposing factors. So these can just be factors that are characteristics of the tree or the environment that it grows in. They're really long-term and are not super obvious to the eye, but they can help diminish the vitality from optimum, is how Manion describes it. So really they can stress the tree out in a very subtle, low-grade way. And one of these included in here in this fairly old diagram, many decades old, is climate change. But then we can have other types of stressors that are more obvious. So inciting stressors, these can be things like defoliating insects, excavation or logging truck damage, soil compaction, drought, events like that. They are really noticeable, and they might be really short term. And they can be more damaging or stressful if the tree is already stressed from these predisposing factors. And then you can also have contributing factors that, again, these are really obvious. These are things like fungal diseases or insects that can really take advantage of that already declining tree. They're opportunistic. And again, these contributing factors or inciting factors might be what we attribute the decline to. So really, when we talk about climate change impacts, when we're thinking about it, it's really this balance in a tree about the carbon budget of the tree. So the tree needs more photosynthesis, more carbon intake than carbon use. And so it's really this balance between these two carbon pools. And most of the time, for most trees, overall, over the whole year, photosynthesis and carbon intake is bigger than carbon use. And this allows trees to have carbon to grow, an extra amount that year, maybe put on a lot of wood and grow really tall, or maybe have extra carbon for reproduction or warding off insects. But there are times when respiration is going to be greater than photosynthesis. And as long as the net balance weighs out that photosynthesis is greater than carbon use, the tree will have extra carbon, but really gets into this problem if for long periods of time respiration is really high. And so I don't know who's in this webinar, so just a little background, very quick, I promise, on just some primary concepts of what I'm talking about. So just a reminder that trees use photosynthesis, carbon dioxide from the air, sun's energy, to create carbohydrates. And then the opposite of this is respiration. That's a breaking down of those carbohydrates and releasing the energy that's stored in those carbohydrates. Key to this process are these little pores on the leaf called stomata, and they regulate the exchange of gases in the leaf. And what's key to these is that they also regulate water. So when they're open, water gases, water vapor, just evaporates from the stomata. And that's called transpiration. It's a necessary cost. It also helps pull that water column from the roots to the leaves and allows trees that are many hundreds of feet tall to transport water up them, which is not against gravity. And so this ability to pull that water column up is really critical. It helps cool the leaf, but it is something it's something like 70% of water in a tree just leaves from this process of transpiration and evaporation. When the balance of inputs, so that photosynthesis, is less than what the carbon that the tree is using, the tree can go in a carbon debt. And so this can happen from a variety of causes, anything that causes the tree to lose an ability to photosynthesize. So something like causes a tree to close those stomata, right? So a drought, maybe the tree is regulating water loss. If the tree loses the ability to photosynthesize, so an insect defoliation, if insects eat all the leaves or many of the leaves, or if the rate of photosynthesis declines, which I'll show how that can happen just in high temperatures. And then also if the respiration demands increase for a tree. So that can just be if there's high energy needs. Maybe the tree is reproducing that year, wants a flower, produce seed. That's a lot of energy needs, and there's a lot of metabolic processes that need to happen, and the rate of respiration can just increase under high temperature. So you can get that balance of photosynthesis versus respiration can change both from higher and lower photosynthesis and higher and lower respiration. And this is the key concept behind tree ring science. So this is an example of tree rings that came out of a red spruce tree. We take a little core, but each one of these rings corresponds to 1 year of growth. So this is the basis of tree ring science. We can compare the width of these rings to climate and see what the tree responds to favorably. So what climate variables lead to more growth and which ones lead to less growth. Because we know that when this carbon budget in the tree is out of whack, the tree will grow a really small ring, as you can see here. And when there's a lot of extra carbon, the tree will grow a really wide ring. Also of note is that trees do have a reserve store of carbon that comes in handy in emergencies and when they require extra carbon. If the tree uses up these, what we call non-structural carbohydrates, are just carbon molecules within the tree that aren't part of cells. the tree can go into what we call carbon starvation, which is as bad as it sounds, right? So that's when we get tree mortality. So how high temperatures relate to photosynthesis is just based on really basic biological processes. So we know that the average air temperature has increased nearly 3 degrees since it was first recorded here in Vermont in 1895. So here it's Fahrenheit on this side, Celsius on the other side. And higher temperature speeds up photosynthesis. It's a really simple biological process in all parts of life, is that more energy in the system makes things go faster. So we can see as, after above freezing, the leaf temperature increases and photosynthesis increases up to a thermal optimum. So that's a maximum level of carbon intake. And for many trees here in Vermont, it's actually lower than you might think. It's about 60 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. And that varies based on elevation, location, species, even time of year. But this is just a general schematic to illustrate how photosynthesis really does respond well to higher temperature. And really, we know that in Vermont, the climate is temperature limiting. So most of the growing season, the temperature is under this threshold for photosynthetic optimum. So if we look at this is a similar graph over here, but it's May to September temperature, so the growing season. You can see it's also increased, but the average growing season temperature in 1895 was 59 degrees, and now it's about 61 degrees. So we're still under this optimum. So there is some ability for trees to increase their photosynthetic rate as average temperatures increase. Higher temperatures also mean a longer growing season. And this, as I just explained, you can see if there's just more days for the tree to photosynthesize, and more total days, about 3 weeks more, there's greater ability for that tree to capture carbon. However, there are some cons to this. Unfortunately, while photosynthesis is limited at higher temperatures over that optimum, so it actually declines as we get past that peak. And respiration, so the breaking of those carbohydrates for energy, is not, I should mention that the reason this decreases is just that parts of the photosynthetic process kind of lose their function. But respiration shows a little bit of a different curve here. Again, this is just a schematic, not super accurate here, but it increases at a slower rate than photosynthesis, but peaks at much higher temperatures. So there's this compensation point when the two processes are pretty equal. Here you have photosynthesis is greater than use, so you get net carbon gain. But here you can see as photosynthesis declines at higher temperatures, you get net carbon loss. A couple other things that come with these higher temperatures with climate change are that we can have higher maximum temperatures in the summer, so heat waves, extreme heat events, and that can lead to just more evaporation. I'm sure we all know that when it's really hot, water evaporates more easily. And that's true for the surfaces of leaves, of soil. And higher temperatures overall are showing that we're getting higher minimum winter temperatures. So winter temperatures are increasing, especially minimum. So the low temperatures we experience in the winter are increasing. And this can mean a shorter snow season or less snow, or maybe even no snow. So how can higher summer temperatures have more water loss, and how do trees respond to that? As I mentioned, we can have just more evaporation from surfaces, and this does include leaves and those stomata. So water will, at higher temperatures, more water will just exit those stomata in just a faster rate. And this also is true from soils. We see that soils dry quite easily when there's higher temperatures. So this does mean that we have a higher possibility of drought. with higher temperatures. But actually we are seeing, the records are showing, we're seeing more precipitation and higher relative humidity. So as our air temperatures increase, the air can hold more water. So what we can show here is this is what's called a Palmer Drought Severity Index. It's just an indice of drought severity. It's kind of a complex way to do it, but it's a good indication of drought severity for seasons and years. And the green are wet years and the yellow are dry years. And you can see this blue line here is a trend. We are having more wet years than we did back in the turn of the century. You can see there is annual variability, and this is really driven by this really wet period we had in the 2000s, but still the trend is we're having fewer droughts. And you can see here, this is what relative humidity, blue being more humidity. And you can see for Vermont here, winter, more humid. We're not seeing as much trend in the spring, a little bit in the summer, and a little bit in the fall, but kind of mixed. Really where we're seeing the increases in the winter, but no big declines in relative humidity are we seeing. So interestingly, there's two strategies for responding to drought. And this illustrates a little bit how vulnerable we are to drought here in Vermont. Luckily, we're not seeing an increase, but our trees are not well adapted to drought. So there's two strategies, although, you know, in reality, we're realizing it's like many things, it's a spectrum. And we like to silo, but that's probably not realistic. But I'll illustrate those two strategies here. So we have isohydric, which is most of our tree species. So our maples, our beeches, birches, cherries, and many of our conifers, or all of our conifers, not adapted to prolonged drought. And what they do when there is drought, they close those stomata on the leaves. And the purpose of this is to preserve that water column, as I mentioned, that really has to be continuous from the roots to the leaves so that water can move through the tree. If it breaks, which means that air gets into it, and we call that embolism, it doesn't function anymore. So that water column is essentially broken and doesn't work. And so these trees, these isohydric trees, they close their stomata. But in doing so, they're not photosynthesizing, right? So they close the stomata, they can't get carbon dioxide from the air into the leaves. And so they risk carbon starvation. It's just a strategy that they have. And they use those stored carbohydrates to get them through these periods of drought. They kind of hang on, you know, dig their heels in and wait it out. On the other hand, you have what we call anisohydric species. These are drought adapted. Not as many species, but the oaks, hickories, chestnut fall into this category. And they keep their stomata open. They kind of go big or go home strategy, right? They risk embolism for photosynthesis. So they continue active photosynthesis, continue carbon capture, but they risk damaging that hydrologic function. But they don't really care. And what's really interesting, and I had to include this because I just think it's a cool way to think about this, is this aligns with their wood anatomy. So isohydric species on the top, this is an example. This is a single ring here, these lines. So growth starts here, and you can, these are all the little xylem cells that allow water to go from the roots to the leaves. And you can see they're all pretty small and the same diameter. Contrast this to this anisohydric species, and they have really big cells here. So that means they can conduct a ton of water, but they're really vulnerable to embolism. As you have a bigger size cell, they're more likely to get air in them and break. But they don't care. They'll just build a new set in the spring. And so isohydric species rely on multiple years of growth to conduct water. You know, these are smaller. And anisohydric species will just grow a new set of these really wide cells every spring. And actually is one of the reasons why these species leaf out later than a lot of the other species. They have to build some wood first before they can conduct water. So it's kind of cool to think about these two different strategies that coexist in our woods. And if you have a site that is, you know, droughty, or you expect it to be vulnerable to drought, you can see why it would be beneficial to favor some of these anisohydric species on that site. Interestingly, as I mentioned a little bit, we're seeing the biggest increases in temperature, not in the summer, as you may expect with climate change. We're actually seeing them in the winter and fall. And so this shows maximum temperature over here on the left and minimum temperature over here on the right. Bigger, warmer increase, bigger increases in temperature. Warmer temperatures are in red, and they're broken up by seasons here. I will say that I wanted to point this out, that minimum summer temperature has increased a lot, but summer maximum temperature hasn't increased all that much. But we're seeing, that's one change we're seeing in summer, but most of the big changes we're seeing are this winter and fall temperatures, particularly minimum temperature. So we're seeing an interesting phenomenon that minimum temperature is rising faster than maximum temperature in a lot of cases. So the difference between minimum and maximum is getting smaller. So higher temperatures in the winter, whether they're higher minimum temperatures or higher maximum temperatures, can mean less snow, shorter snow season. And in fact, we're seeing a really big increase in December to March. Minimum temperature, we're seeing a 5-degree increase over this same time frame when I showed these multiple graphs. That's huge, right? So that's a really significant increase in the minimum winter temperature. Again, lots of year-to-year variability, but that trend is significant. And snow in our forest really serves a purpose of insulation. So it keeps things stable in the soil. We know that snow means that a snowpack means that there's less deep soil freezing and fewer freeze-thaw events. So there's less fluctuation in the soil temperature. And when we do have experiments where we've removed the snow in the forest, which we have done, we know that that means more root damage. And this root damage can lead to growth reduction, so it shifts that carbon balance again, right? So there's damage, there's a need for repair of those roots, and so we actually see that evident in the growth of the tree in subsequent years. And it can affect transpiration. If those roots are damaged, that's where water is getting sucked in from the soil. That can affect the tree's physiology. And it can also mean some other things for general forest ecology, is that if we have an early spring snowmelt like we did this year, we can see that there's less water availability, which is really important when trees are leafing out. A lot of other processes are happening, and we can actually have spring droughts, as we have seen. One thing that is interesting as we see this winter minimum temperature increase over the years, that's generally favorable to the southern tree species. So what's really limited a lot of species from moving to other areas, moving north, is those minimum cold temperatures, our -20-degree temperatures in the winter that we experience. Southern species will get damage in those temperatures. And if we're seeing fewer of those extreme cold events, southern species, it's expected that they'll do more favorably here. And we're already seeing that. I think a lot of agricultural crops are seeing that effect. Peaches have been marginally hardy here in Vermont, and they're able to grow in a lot more places than they used to be able to. Higher fall temperatures can mean a longer growing season, which we're certainly seeing this effect on trees. And probably, again, if you're a gardener or a farmer, you've seen this. We have really long periods of time in the fall where trees can photosynthesize, actually. So if it's really favorable in the fall, they can continue with carbon capture. The key is if they have not lost their leaves. So leaf senescence hasn't happened, right? So you can see how this phenomenon, warmer fall temperatures, if deciduous trees have lost their leaves, conifers who keep their leaves, or evergreen conifers, I should qualify that, may be able to continue carbon capture and photosynthesis as their co-occurring trees are going dormant. And the key here again is if water isn't limiting, but as I've mentioned, all seasons are getting wetter, including fall. You can see here we have fall precipitation increasing over time, about almost 2 inches a century. But one thing that's really interesting, and we don't really know the capacity here for trees in the forest, but we do know that trees can acclimate to changing temperatures. So they can actually adjust their physiology and shift their photosynthetic optima, right? So that means that their maximum rate of photosynthesis occurs at a higher temperature, but also means that decline in photosynthesis doesn't happen until higher temperatures are reached. I will say we know a lot of this information from seedling studies, because as you can imagine, it's really hard to measure this in trees in the forest. We do expect a similar acclimation to be occurring in our trees. And they can also reduce the rate of respiration. Again, this just a schematic to show that those rates are probably not realistic, but trees can adjust the rate of respiration. And so that compensation point, that place where respiration and photosynthesis are equal, can occur at a much higher temperature. There's also other things that trees can do. They can increase the number or size of their leaves. They can change the number of stomata on their leaves. All these changes take some time for trees to adapt and acclimate to new conditions, but they can do that. Also, what's interesting about climate change is climate change is caused by more CO2 in the atmosphere, in the air, and CO2 is essentially, plant food, plant energy. So what this means for trees is that it changes that resource balance. So since 1960, we have seen a 30% increase in CO2 in the air. And what this, means is that trees could, keep their stomata open for the same amount of time as they did in 1960, but get 30% more carbon out of it. Or the other option is that they can keep their stomata open for 30% less time and still get the same amount of carbon. And essentially they'll lose less water for the same amount of carbon gain. So we call this, this ratio of carbon gain to water loss is called water use efficiency. And so increased concentrations of carbon dioxide in the air are actually helping trees be more efficient with their use of water, because those stomata are really, it is a necessary cost. They lose water in that process, but water is really critical in tree physiology. So holding on to it is always the best option. And as we're seeing in Vermont, there have been some studies looking at water use efficiency, and we're seeing both options are occurring, both strategies are occurring in trees. And as we're seeing precipitation is increasing and moisture is increasing with climate change, trees may not need to close their stomata as much, so that drought tolerance or lack of drought tolerance of a lot of our species might not be as critical if we do not experience as much drought. All right, so what do we know about how trees in Vermont are responding to climate change? What's the research tell us? And again, I'll just say that there's a lot we're still discovering about how trees respond to climate change, and there's a lot of variability. So trees have immense genetic variability within a species. So a sugar maple growing in the Northeast Kingdom is going to be very different than a sugar maple growing in Bennington. So one way that we've looked at how trees might respond to climate change is using information on where trees are currently growing. So this is data from U.S. Forest Service Climate Change Tree Atlas, which is pretty neat. And it shows here the range of, this is balsam fir to illustrate cold-loving species. So balsam fir really doesn't grow much more south of us here in Vermont. It grows quite a bit north and does grow way up into Canada, but we don't share data across those boundaries. So these, it's really showing just where it exists in the United States. The different colors here are a measure of importance. So that's a combination of the number of trees at that location and the size. So to get a high importance value, you have a lot of trees that are big. And what they did here is they just took each one of these locations and mapped it on this graph based on that location's average total precipitation and average temperature. And you can see that gives us this climate envelope or climate niche for balsam fir. And if we look at the average temperature in 1895, we're really solidly in that niche for balsam fir. If we look at what the temperature is, and this is already a little dated in 2019, I need to add 2020 data onto here. We can see that we are getting kind of at that, temperature limit of where balsam fir exists. That doesn't mean balsam fir can't persist in those conditions. It just probably isn't as competitive. When we look at precipitation, again, 1895, looking at current precipitation, that's a less of a limiting factor here. We're still solidly in the tolerance of this species. Contrast this to red oak, very warm loving species. We're sort of at its, almost at its northern range here in Vermont. It exists more higher importance values south of us. Again, same concept, plotting the locations on this figure, and much wider, range of tolerance here for red oak. You can see, put Vermont's average temperature in 2019. We're actually becoming more favorable for red oak here, and that has been the projection that species like balsam fir may decline in suitable habitat, where species like red oak, warm-loving species, may increase. Precipitation, showing our increases in precipitation, again, less limiting. And these are, this is total precipitation. Average annual temperature does not capture the seasonal variability that would accompany those changes. So this is just to illustrate the differences and how we think about trees under climate change. So that's based on, this is one way to look at it, based on where the trees are growing currently and what conditions exist at those locations. This doesn't include the ability of the trees to adapt or acclimate to new and novel conditions. It just looks at the current status. So another way that we can look at climate and growth relationships, as I mentioned, are by tree rings. And so I'm going to summarize some of what we know about how some of our common trees in Vermont respond to climate based on tree ring analyses and other types of measurements, physiological measurements. So red spruce is actually a species we probably know the most about, surprisingly, and that's really because it's been documented damage and history from acid rain. So there's quite a lot of analysis looking into red spruce response to environmental conditions. And what we know is that red spruce, like many of our trees here in Vermont, are actually growing fairly well in the last few decades. And one of the reasons for red spruce is that we're seeing this higher temperature outside the traditional growing season is really favorable. As I mentioned, conifers, when they have their leaves all year, if there's a really mild fall, they can take advantage of that situation. Whereas, maybe a sugar maple growing next to that red spruce already started fall senescence and losing its leaves and can't take advantage of that situation. We're seeing, interestingly, precipitation is becoming increasingly important for red spruce, and this is again a thread that continues for a lot of these other species. And we think that that's probably related to extreme heat. So this combination of climate change is bringing some extreme heat waves in the summer, which is not favorable to red spruce and most other trees. But this combination of extreme heat and precipitation being low is problematic. Eastern hemlock, we're seeing that that this species has a unfavorable response to extreme heat in the spring and early summer. So similar to red spruce, but a little bit earlier in the growing season. And again, a positive response to precipitation. Sugar maple, it won't come to surprise to many of you, but loves snowpack, and spring moisture is really critical for growth, for good growth. Again, this trend of extreme heat in the summer is not favorable for the species. Red maple, really, probably going to be a climate winner. We're not seeing a lot of negative responses to climate variables, really just positive responses. It's growing really well in some limited studies that have happened. We consider it high ecological amplitude, just can grow lots of places and kind of responds favorably to climate, including higher temperatures in the summer and growing season. Red oak is one of our southern species, but remember that anisohydric strategy that it imposes for drought means it's very drought tolerant, but it still requires, summer moisture and growing season moisture is still really important for the species. Again, extreme heat in the summer is not very favorable to red oak. And really, that's a combination when we have heat and low precipitation again. Very little is known about American beech. People do not want to study American beech. And one of the reasons for that is beech bark disease has made it really hard to disentangle the carbon effects of that disease versus the carbon effects of climate. We do know that its cousin, European beech, is sensitive to a combination of drought and extreme heat in the summer. So again, we're seeing this trend in really all of our species, maybe minus red maple. This combination of extreme heat waves and low precipitation in the summer can be problematic to their carbon balance. Yellow birch, we really have limited research on this species as well, but we do know it actually shows a positive growth response this summer, but I think more work needs to look into this species across a broader range. For white ash, we don't have much work that's Vermont specific, but we do know spring moisture is really critical to this species. Again, drought and high temperature, the combination of the two, particularly in spring for this species, are problematic. And lastly, balsam fir. Again, this extreme heat in the summer is not favorable. Oop, that came in the wrong order. But we are seeing this extended growing season is pretty good for balsam fir. Again, it grows in our really cold spots, high elevations in Vermont, Northeast Kingdom, cold air drainages. So extended growing season, if you think of that photosynthetic curve, just pushes it a little bit higher and a higher photosynthetic rate and more time to photosynthesize. White pine, again, extreme heat in summer, not favorable. That's not Vermont specific, but probably based on all the other species and the information we know about the species, probably pretty realistic. So take home messages, just to summarize, it's a lot of information, but kind of summarize some of the things I mentioned. So climate change will bring both good and bad changes for Vermont trees. I want to stress this, it's not doom and gloom, but it's something that we need to pay attention to and consider in all of our work that we do, all of our decision making, and recognize that change might be subtle. It's really hard to see climate change happening unless you think of extreme rainfall events or these ice storms, but there can be really subtle changes happening from this annual increase in precipitation and temperature. And as I illustrated in the beginning, this multiple stressor idea can push trees over the edge, and thinking about that carbon balance between what the tree can take in versus what it's using, it can be helpful for thinking about tree health and vigor. Longer growing seasons and warmer temperatures are, we're seeing that they actually are beneficial to some species. As I said, we're seeing increased growth rates for a lot of trees with that extended growing season. But really, that seems like the main vulnerability for our tree species are summer heat waves, especially if they coincide with low moisture events. And most of our species are really not very drought tolerant. So thinking about that in a forest site of favoring some drought tolerant species where we can. Interestingly, the cause of the climate change, higher CO2, is actually, good for trees. It's making them more efficient at using water, and then coupled with precipitation increasing, trees are maybe less limited by water in the future. But we have to remember that a lot of this is so specific to the species physiology, but also the tree's physiology, its general health, site conditions. So there are a lot of interactions and a lot of factors that I really couldn't cover here. This is kind of a general overview of why climate change affects tree physiology, but specific vulnerabilities are a lot more complex. I'll just end with putting my email here and also plugging, I've been updating the FPR website to have a climate change, bigger climate change section, and I'm adding to that. There's not a lot there now, but I will be putting more resources here and information, links to good sources to get information and whatnot. So keep checking that. Over time. There's a lot of information on carbon as well, forest carbon, if you're interested in looking at that. All right, well, that's all I have. So whirlwind tour of climate change impacts to trees. I hope people are still here, but I'll open it to questions.
Thanks, Allie. That was a really great talk, and we definitely still have plenty of people here. So and we have a few questions coming into the chat, or excuse me, to the question tab on the right side of the dashboard there. Please feel free to continue to put questions in there as we're answering the ones that are in there already. The first question we have, Allie, is about some of the moisture regimens in Vermont. Says that although we're getting wetter and total moisture seems to be increasing, that there seem to be prolonged periods of midsummer droughts. How does the swing in moisture between high moisture and then a drought in the summertime, how does that swing impact the trees?
Yeah, that is I think that anecdotally we're noticing that hasn't really been picked up in the drought data, that we're seeing an increase in droughts, but I totally agree with that, especially last summer, and we're projected to potentially have a drought this summer. I will say that, even though our species are not well adapted to drought, they shut their stomata down, kind of hunker down, they can persist like that for quite a while. It's when we have multiple years of droughts or multiple stressors that interact. So say, for example, we have a drought and then an insect outbreak. That can kind of push those trees over the edge, but just a drought, trees have really quite a large amount of stored carbohydrates. It's pretty impressive, though. Those non-structural carbohydrates can be many decades old, and so they can persist. And then, really, once they can photosynthesize again, they can make up for that lack of photosynthesis. It's really incredible. A tree doesn't need that much time to make up for periods in the year when respiration was greater than photosynthesis. So as long as there's some really favorable conditions after that, they can kind of, make up the difference. When we do, the concern I have is we have multiple years of drought in a row. So poor growing seasons one year after the other really can deplete those carbon reserves.
Great, thanks, Allie. The second question is about relative importance data and how that looks for sugar maple in the traditional range with increases in temperature.
Yeah, good question. So it's we're still solidly in the range for that same, looking at the balsam fir, red oak example I gave. If you do that for sugar maple, we're still solidly in the range. So what the projection is for sugar maple here, we have so much of it. We really have a lot of sugar maple. We're not going to see a total loss of sugar maple with climate change. It's really not. It might not be as favorable for growth in some of the warm locations in our state. So maybe some of the valleys, because it really can grow pretty much, lots of different places in our state. So we might see that it declines in health in some of the lower elevations, some of the warmer pockets, south-facing slopes. And those might be places where we see species like red oak or red maple take over a little bit more. But in many of our higher, higher elevation areas, it's still solidly in the range. And I would say that the way I described those was a little simplistic. For balsam fir, I showed the state's temperature increasing, right? So Vermont's total for the entire state, its average temperature increasing, but where we know balsam fir exists is not throughout the state. It's really in those cold locations, Northeast Kingdom, higher elevations. So really, when you put that average temperature on there, it's going to be lower than the state's average temperature. So really, you have to kind of look at specific sites overall. But feel free to, the climate change tree atlas is really fun to poke around on. And if you can't find it, let me know. I can send you a link. But it's cool to look at some of the different species and what some of the projections are. And those are projections, right? It's decline in suitable habitat, not necessarily the growth or vigor of those trees.
Great, thanks, Allie. To kind of piggyback on that one, there was another question about temperature here. That it was mentioned that trees can acclimate to changes in temperature. What's the time frame that these adaptations can occur?
Yeah, so that's kind of hard to know. Like I mentioned, that we don't really know about that for trees in the forest because it's really hard for us to, create a scientific experiment where we heat up a forest. People have tried. Most of the ways we know to do that are experiments with seedlings and saplings. And we do know physiology changes with different size of trees, different age of trees, different canopy position. So that's a little bit hard. But the changes can happen, within, it happens pretty fast, actually. The key is that it can't be an immense change in temperature because that could just stress the tree out. But a few degrees increase in temperature, I've seen a lot of the studies have done. The trees respond, within a few weeks, a few months to that change. One thing that's interesting that a lot of studies have shown, maybe a 5-degree increase in ambient temperature, is it doesn't mean a 5-degree increase in photosynthetic optimum. It usually means a 2 or 3-degree increase. So the rate of increase in the air temperature is not the same of the increase in the tree's physiology. It lags behind a little bit. But usually in all those studies, they still showed that was still, very optimum for the specific species at their photosynthetic rate.
Great, thanks, Allie. They keep coming in, so we'll keep going.
Okay.
There's a question about, and I think I'm interpreting this right, which climate factors are most likely to favor some of those inciting factors that you had listed to cause damage on trees? Do we have a sense of that, or is it just kind of case by case?
Yeah, so those inciting factors are, they can be all sorts of things. They can be human cause, they can be climate related. So yeah, one of them, as is drought. Certainly wasn't listed on there, but that wasn't comprehensive of all the inciting factors, but there, I would say an ice storm would be one of those, or maybe a wind event, microburst, of any event that causes, damage that is not, a subtle long-term event. So certainly, right, I talked about drought. I didn't talk about, ice storms and things like that, but I did mention that those minimum winter temperatures are increasing, and we are seeing increases in the fall and spring temperatures. So an ice storm just occurs when precipitation is falling that's right around the freezing temperature. So maybe surfaces of the trees are cold, maybe the precipitation falls through different temperature strata in the air. So you can get all these different events that cause, ice formation on the trees, and that, breaks stems, causes power outages, all sorts of things like that can occur. As far as, other events like increases in hurricanes or windstorms, it's really hard for us to detect if those are increasing with climate change. They occur so infrequently that it's really hard. We just don't have the data to look at those changes. And that sort of gets to the, some of the drought effects too. As we saw last summer, drought wasn't uniform across the state. It's really localized. It's dependent on, local weather patterns, but also local site factors. So it's actually hard for us to really look at that, look at changes in specific sites, because often we don't have data that extends back in time very far. We have, some data from Burlington Weather Station that extends back to 1895, but a lot of these climate-related indexes that we are looking at now, we just don't have the information to look at long-term trends.
Great. The next question is kind of based on some individual observations. Someone said that they've noticed increases in hardwood decline in unmanaged stands and have considered that that's due to 50 years of decreased snowpack and the impacts on soil biology, roots, and other elements of the tree's capacity to uptake and process nutrients. Is the research showing this to be true?
Yes. So so the impact of reduced snow is that fine root mortality. So it's really not the big roots that get damaged when there's freeze-thaw cycles in the soil. So it's really fine roots, so small feeder roots. If you've dug around in the forest, you've seen those. They're usually pretty dense to get through, and they're often very shallow. So they're not deep, especially for a species like sugar maple, very shallow roots. And so, yeah, that does limit its water uptake, but also roots are important for mineral uptake. So that can certainly happen. One explanation for why you're seeing unmanaged stands versus managed stands. Unmanaged stand could just have higher tree density, right? So resources are, limited in a forest, and if you have more trees, there's more competition for those resources. So that can certainly, you get, stand exclusion effect of trees just, not being able to compete well with their neighbor. And so that's, of course, one of the basis for forest management of thinning out the stand to allow the, chosen trees to grow better and have higher vigor. It is really hard, I would say, to attribute a specific climate change event in a forest like that. As I illustrated, there's lots of different things going on, and you really have to do an analysis to look at that with the tree rings and different factors at that site to attribute it to lower snowpack.
Great, thanks, Allie. Are we aware of any fungal communities that are helping trees adjust to climate change?
Yeah, certain. So that might be referencing mycorrhizae, which are a fungi that have relationships with tree roots. And there's two different types, but they both do kind of similar functions. They help the tree get minerals from the soil, water, in exchange the tree gives the fungi carbohydrates. So it's actually a cost to the tree, but it ends up working out. And yes, we do know that mycorrhizae do help trees get through stressful events, right? So they, especially with the increasing their area for moisture uptake can be very beneficial. We also know that trees connect to each other via roots. So this is kind of a growing area. I would say just in general, mycorrhizae and below ground networks of roots are really not well understood and only getting interest, I would say, not that long, fairly recently. And so trees can exchange resources by connecting their roots, and they will exchange resources with, species of their own type, but even other species. So we do know that those systems help trees in times of stress, and particularly help, smaller trees and trees that might be in the understory and kind of at that carbon. I didn't talk about different tree sizes and canopy positions, but trees in the understory are really at that, kind of threshold of carbon debt. They're very much, any carbon they can get is helpful because they don't have a lot of sunlight. They're competing with for a lot of resources and space.
Great, just got a few more here, Ali, if we can stick around for maybe a couple minutes after 9:30. Next one is, what do we know about the plasticity of tree populations in Vermont with their ability to respond to temperature and moisture? And you kind of addressed that. But in addition to that, it's kind of the monkey in the room, or the elephant in the room rather, is there a consideration of bringing southern population genetics into Vermont through assisted migration?
Yeah, no, this is a great question, and I meant to mention it, but I didn't. So thank you for bringing up this. That we know that there's substantial variability within a species. So I talked about red spruce, white pine, sugar maple. This is what they're responding to, and there are some really, we do know across these species we can make these generalizations. But a specific location, specific stand, specific part of our state, a species might be responding to environmental variables very differently. So we know that there are what we call climal differences, which are just adaptations based on where the species exists. So, sugar maple growing at 1,600 feet here in Vermont versus one growing at 200 feet, they're just going to have their photosynthetic optimum is going to be different. Their, all these sorts of physiological processes will be different. And we do know there's been work that has shown that variability within a species, just genetic variability, not only adaptation, can be greater within a species than between species. So, a species like sugar maple that exists, throughout our state, and I'm not a tree geneticist, and so I don't know how much this has been studied for sugar maple, but I would imagine that the genetic variability is quite high for a species like sugar maple. And we often see this, where you can see really different bark characteristics, different leaf characteristics, and so we can have these subpopulations. And there are some species that we have here in Vermont that have very limited genetic variability. Red spruce is one of them. And part of that is it was severely logged. Charlie Cogbill has done some work on this, at looking at the pre-settlement forest composition, and a majority of red spruce was cut from our forest. So that's just removing that genetic population, and what was left, we think, has has a restricted genetic variability. And there's some other qualities of red spruce that mean that has kind of a not as big of a genetic variability than some other species, but certainly that's part of it. And plasticity is a great word, because that just means like how adaptable are different species, and that gets into that changing that photosynthetic optimum. How quickly can a species do that? How much can they do that? How can they change their leaf? How many leaves they have, how big their leaves are the stomata numerous or limited? And all those are different responses that trees can have to alter their own physiology in response to climate change. Josh, remind me what the second part of that question was.
The second part was about assisted migration.
Oh, yes, thank you. Yeah, so assisted migration of, I think specifically question was about southern genetics. there are some folks that are doing plantings to try to propagate southern species. It is a little bit hard for us to select certain genetics right now, and that's solely because we just don't have that ability in our tree nursery stock. But that would be the ideal, right? That we could, if you wanted to plant some red oak in the Northeast Kingdom, that you'd get a red oak genetic population that's maybe, from central Vermont or just a little bit south of the Northeast Kingdom. That's just not how a lot of our tree propagation works right now, although that is getting more and more interest of thinking about where the seed source comes from that was used to propagate those seedlings. Right now, we're often, if we're planting red oak in the woods to propagate a southern species, we're just getting whatever red oak are available. And sometimes that's even red oak from the Midwest. We just don't have the tree nursery capacity. So making a plug for tree nursery capacity to increase, and specifically focusing on some of those future climate adapted species that we could use.
Thanks, Allie. Can you offer 1 to 2 forest management recommendations to enhance sugar maple's competitiveness given the stresses that you outlined?
Yeah, I think for sugar maple, reducing root soil and root damage is really important with that shallow root system. One thing I have noticed, and this has not been studied, although I would love to look into this, is when we have these extreme rain events, I'm seeing more evidence that the duff layer is getting washed off. So I think I had a picture early on in this presentation where it's water running across the surface of the forest. So when we get extreme water events, the water might not percolate down, and we're losing that. Sometimes it can wash the leaf litter off and expose roots. And when we have a species like sugar maple with fine roots, when those are exposed, they can dry out and die. So I'd say one really great thing is controlling water on your site, adding more downwoody material. That really helps to keep water in the soil. It slows down water. It can stop like detritus. It can kind of hold up leaf litter and sticks and other detritus in the forest. So that can be really important. We can't do a lot about increasing snowpack. There is some evidence for a species like sugar maple that I think this occurs in some sugar bushes, but liming, adding calcium, it's really sugar maple is a very nutrient needy species. And so that's one of the things that can really help making sure you have enough, doing a soil test if you're worried about seeing what the calcium content is in your soil. I think, again, we've really not focused a lot on soil in the past, and we're recognizing how important soil is in protecting soil and in tree health and forest ecosystem health.
That's great, Allie. Thanks for taking the time to answer all these questions. There's one more here that I think I'm just going to kind of summarize that was kind of addressing the mention that you had of some lesser understood hardwood species in Vermont in terms of research with response to climate change, like American beech and yellow birch. The question was about whether there's renewed interest or a new interest in doing more research on those species, and that if there is that interest, foresters and land managers might be able to provide some locations of disease-free beech stands or the like. So yeah. I think that's maybe just a plug for anybody on the line who might be considering that foresters and managers could be a good resource for that.
That's great. Yeah, love to see that partnership.
Well, I think we're definitely over time here. And Allie, thanks so much for a great talk and for responding to all these excellent questions. I just want to let folks know that when you close out of this, you'll have a survey pop up so that you can get SAF credits if you're interested in that. I did not mention at the outset that this is actually approved for 1 ISA credit as well. So if you're interested in that, answer the relevant question in the survey there. Next week, we'll continue our series on Tuesday at 8:30. We have a split webinar. Half of it is on beech leaf disease, and the other is on spotted lanternfly. So if those topics interest you, please join us. Again, these are all being recorded and will be available through the Our Vermont Woods website. Many thanks to Kate Ford for helping get this going today and managing the GoToWebinar platform. And again, thanks very much for joining us.